Greetings, Introduction to Culture Anthropology course. We're in our second week or module, and we've experienced some technical difficulties with the videos as well as with the focus group presentation and the Keepers Inquiries. It is my hope after this most recent visit to the Blackboard and online teaching and learning office that these problems have been resolved. This week, I would like to discuss the medium in which I communicate with you, the spoken word, as well as through visual text. In fact, I want to do something even more significant. I want to discuss language with you and why language is so important for anthropologists. So I'm going to walk you through certain highlight points of the chapter. However, I strongly encourage that you read the chapter because it's really important. And just as much as culture is important to what culture anthropologists do, language becomes one of those principal vehicles by which we ascertain certain ideas about culture. So let's proceed. Culture and language. Again, this is chapter 3. And at the end of this week's module, you have the option of taking a test that will cover this, chapter 3, as well as chapter 5. Let's begin. At the end of this chapter, you should be able to explain why language is so powerful and such a powerful means of communication. Using the 5 distinctive properties of the human language as offered to us by the anthropologist and linguist Hackett. In fact, he offered us 13 important principles of language, but we're going to talk about 5. But you should be able to describe how words are formed through combinations of discrete sounds, which we call phonemes, and we'll talk about that. And you should be able to discuss the modern day sort of global forces that result in the spread and survival of some languages and the destruction of others, as well as the contraction and possible extinction of others. You should be able to explain some ways messages are communicated non-verbally and how speech is affected by social context. And then finally, we want to sort of grapple with one of the profound theories with regards to culture and language, which was offered to us by Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf, who Benjamin Whorf was in fact Sapir's student at Yale University. But we want to talk about the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. Language is so important, and it consists of shared knowledge, shared sounds, shared words, shared meanings, and a shared sense of what the grammatical rules are of language. The grammatical rules for sending and receiving simple and sometimes complex messages. The ability to speak, the right to comprehend messages and languages requires knowledge of an enormous amount of linguistic units, of sounds, of words, of rules of combining them. And again, of grammar, of syntax, and even just figuring out what the appropriate word choice is. And I don't have to tell you how important language is. If you are able to communicate well, you're treated well. If in fact you communicate in very deficient ways, often you're stigmatized, and we'll talk about that shortly. But there is no other living creature that has the capacity as the Homo sapiens to in fact communicate very complex ideas as we do. In fact, one might even go as far to say that we are biologically built to in fact communicate. So let me just recap this, and I'm going to talk about the biology in just a second. Language is shared knowledge of sounds, of words, of meanings, of grammatical rules that we send and receive, or we use to send and receive messages. And biologically, Homo sapiens are the only ones that have evolved for the complex type of language that we all know and are familiar with. Of course, elephants, whales, dolphins, apes likewise perform very impressive feats with communication. They can't do it the way that we can. Language shaped the humans or humanity's biological evolution. Most obvious to us is that the speech regions of the brain is shaped by the need to be able to communicate. The vocal tracts, which includes a lot of things. The alveolar ridge, which is in the inside of the mouth. The tongue. The nasal passages. The larynx. Our lungs. All of these are important features of our ability and physical capacity to speak. Language, again, allows people to communicate about concrete persons and places and things and actions and events. Some of us, most recently, had conversations about the events that happened in Charlotte as a result of Keith Lamont Scott's questionable shooting and homicide. The social learning by which a child acquires language would be impossible without language. Let me restate that. The social learning by which a child acquires culture would be impossible without language. And as you know, in the last week module, we discussed the fact that children are socialized or enculturated into a society. And that is how in which, as a member of that society, they begin to take on the cultural understandings and sensibilities and sensitivities and cultural knowledge and behavioral patterns of a particular society. And it is through language that we are able, again, to enculturate. There are some important aspects, if you will, to language. There's important principles or properties, if you will, of language. Now, Charles Hackett, again, who was a really important anthropologist and linguist, gave us these 13 principles of language. And I'm going to talk about these 5 principles here. That is on your concept review. And these 5 principles is discreteness, arbitrariness, productivity, displacement, and multimedia potential. Discreteness, first and foremost, it means that when speaking, people have the knowledge of combining sound. And they understand the rules and the conventions of connecting sound, or what we call discrete units of sound. And so, for example, they understand, and the understanding only happens by which we are members of a particular culture. So, the letter J makes the J sound. The letter U makes the sound, depending on the context. The letter M makes the sound, and the letter P makes the P sound. And we understand that combining these discrete pieces of sound, or phonemes, which we'll discuss shortly, creates the word jump. So there is a discreteness that is built into our ability to communicate. Discreteness of sound, units of sound that allows us to communicate words. And of course, when we create words, then in fact we're associating meanings to those words, and then when you assemble words, then you are developing very complex strings of thought, complex ideas. Let me backtrack a little bit here and just sort of discuss grammar with you. And I'm going to come back to discreteness. Grammar is the total system of linguistic knowledge that allows a speaker of a language to send meaningful messages and the hearers to understand them. In other words, that we can package thought and send it through and package it in a way that is consistent with cultural knowledge or the cultural grammar, but send it to a receiver, and they can unpack it and process it, understand it, and then send it back to us. Well, that's really profound for the human condition. Grammar knowledge is unconscious. Those who share a language cannot verbalize the knowledge that allows them to communicate with one another. In fact, we often don't call this knowledge to the forefront, unless, again, you're called on to teach it. Thinking about grammar and syntax, we learn that we must punctuate all of our complete thoughts in written form. But we almost do so unconsciously. No one has to tell us. In fact, sometimes we may slip and we're reminded, but no one really has to tell us. And when we string together these different sounds into words and words into sort of complete thoughts or sentences, and sentences into very complex ideas, we don't think about consciously the way in which grammar should shape that form of communication or the content of that communication. Although as a college student, most professors want you to become aware, in fact, of grammar or grammatical knowledge. In other words, to write with the consciousness of grammar. But it is all too easy for us to forget, or not necessarily forget, to submerge it in the unconscious scape of our being. Grammar knowledge is unconscious, but it is also intuitive, meaning that we don't discuss it explicitly, but we know it. The speaking and understanding are automatic, and we ordinarily do not need to think about how to speak or understand linguistic messages. The important thing to understand about language is that I need to be able to send a message that allows for the receiver to understand it, to understand the grammar of it, to be able to process the content of my message, and then to be able to respond appropriately. Now, in so doing, I want to unpack some points here about language. I want to talk about language just very briefly, or at least dialects. There are variations in a single language based on many factors. Region, for example. People in California don't speak the same way as folk in New York, and folk in New York don't speak the same way as folk in New Jersey, for that matter, or people in New Jersey, and that might be very close to that tri-state area, and so you might find more similarities than differences. But let's contrast the tri-state area, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, with South Carolina. We all know that there's a difference with regards to region in how we articulate, how we inflect our dialect. Subculture also impacts the way in which we speak. Ethnic identity impacts the way we speak, and socioeconomic class. And this may be obvious to some. If you in fact go to Harvard, and if you in fact attend University of North Carolina, Charlotte campus, the ways in which you speak, the dialect will be different. And here I have examples of dialect. You have the English dialect, the Welsh dialect, the American South, the Australian dialect, Jamaican dialect, Louisianan Creole, Black English, or what is referred to as African American English vernacular, or what is often referred to on a more colloquial level as Ebonics. And then you have Spanglish. Now let's come back and begin to sort of talk about words and sound, and remember that I'm going to pivot back and talk about those 5 important principles of communication. Phonology. Phonology is the study of sound, systems of language. Phonology it is not only the study of sound, but in some ways, how do we produce those sounds? What are the smallest units of sounds that speakers unconsciously recognize as distinctive from other sounds? In other words, that when we think about a grunt, right? Where does that come from, and how is that recognized in a sort of pantheon of sounds in a given language? Because a grunt in the American culture may seem bizarre, may indicate distress or some other issue, but perhaps a grunt in a more foreign language is part of the phonetic system. Phonetic system is a system of sounds, and the smallest unit of sound is called a phoneme. When one phoneme is substituted for another in a morpheme which is a collection of sounds that we often refer to as words, the meaning of the morpheme alters. So for example, if I take the word jump, I mentioned jumped earlier, and I changed the J with a P. So instead of jump, I got pump. Well, I changed that phoneme at the beginning of J-U-M-P. I switched out J for P, and it changed the meaning of the word. Phonemes are often sort of marked by these linguistic sort of slash marks, sort of absolute marks that you might use in general math. And that is to say that to show that this particular sound, this is an absolute sound in a given language. So for example, you might have the slash marks in front of a F, F, a T, T, a B, B, a N, N, Z, Z, and an L, L. And that's the very sort of basic unit of sound that we're looking for. It was speaking about dialect that we inflect, or that we emphasize certain parts of sound differently based on region, based on subculture, ethnic identity, based on socioeconomic standing. We also sort of change the meanings of sound by the way in which we inflect sound, our pitch. Language in which the changing voice there's a change in the pitch within a word also alters the meanings of some words. So for example, if I say she's gone home, It's a rather declarative statement. She's going home. How about I change the pitch? In other words, I speed it up instead of slowing it down. She's going home. Now, just a change in the tone and pitch makes something that was a simple declarative statement now appear as more interrogative. We call these tonal languages. And in your book, there's an example of a tonal language, the NUPE, for example, which is an African tonal language. And so here you have 3 words. For me, phonetically, that represents ba. And as you increase the tone, ba, it means to be sour. Yucks. Like lemon. Or ba means to cut. Or ba means to count. And so this one word, ba, whether it is pronounced with, in terms of its tone, with the high pitch, mid, or low pitch, changes the meaning. Let's talk about words and meanings. The study of words, it's called morphology. It's the study of the meaningful sound sequences and the rules by which these meanings are formed, or these words are formed. Morphology is the study of units of meaning in a language. So jump is a collection of phonemes that is pulled together by words, or it's a collection of phonemes that in fact is pulled together by sounds, not words, and that it produces a particular sort of meaning. And there are rules that go with it. Often we don't see words that begin with PM or TN because the conventional use of words, that doesn't work, that doesn't go. Morphemes are any sequence of phonemes that carry meaning. Now there's 2 types of morphemes, okay? There are those free morphemes. I would love to be free. There's those free morphemes. These are a sequence of sounds that produce meaning that can stand on their own. So for example, I have here desire, possible, health, complete, anthropology, and establish. Then there's another type of morpheme. And these morphemes I often call affixes, right? Prefixes and suffixes. But they don't necessarily have to be articulated in that way, but I refer to them as affixes. And these are bounded morphemes, and a bounded morpheme attached to a free morpheme to alter its meaning. So, desire is the free morpheme. Un is the bounded morpheme. Undesire. M is the bounded morpheme. That is I am. Possible is the free morpheme. Impossible. Incomplete. Right? Established with the ed on the end. Established being the free morpheme. Ed being the bounded morpheme. Now, I want to point this out. I said earlier that it doesn't have to be affixes. It doesn't have to be a prefix or suffix. It can be a tense. So, for example, ed. It can be changing a word to an adverb with an ly. So anything that you attach to a free morpheme, it becomes a bounded morpheme. And we're not necessarily discussing compound words. But compound words you can bring to complete free morphemes together and sort of bind them. Language is just really interesting, and we don't often think about morphemes, and we don't think about bounded morphemes, and we don't think about phonemes, but anthropologists do. And we don't, as anthropologists, we don't necessarily make that the central part of our work, but language is very important to our work because language is the vehicle of culture. And so often when you go into foreign places, the first thing you have to do is learn the culture. And you learn the culture through the language, so you learn the language. And by learning the language, you learn what the local conventions are of the language. And you do it without judgment. In fact, anthropologists, we say that there is no one language that is more superior to another language. The importance of language in communication is that I can send a message and to a receiver, and the receiver, in fact, can understand the message and return it to me. An example of a bounded morpheme, the English rule for forming a plural noun from a singular noun is usually done by adding either the bounded morpheme of z or s rather, as in beads or colors or eggs, as in lamps, steaks, pots. Now you say, well, why do we have a slash mark for the z? Because that represents the basic unit of sound, and when you say beads, it comes across like a Z sound, although we know we're adding an S, and the S becomes the bounded morpheme. Colors, you feel the Z sound at the end, but we know that we're adding an S. Or it can simply be the phonetic sound of an S, lamps, steaks, pots, as opposed to eggs, and you can hear in the end. But all of this means more than one. Now, there's other ways of communicating. There's nonverbal communication, and I love nonverbal communication. An anthropologist pays attention to written and spoken language as much as we pay attention to nonverbal language or nonverbal communication. Kinesics, which is the study of the role of the body motions in communication. I'll give you a perfect example. As a person of color, as a professor of color, as an American of color, it is unfortunately and sadly, I can't go into a store in the mall without being followed. And one of the ways in which, and I shouldn't have to do this, but one of the ways in which I try to mitigate against the stigma that's applied to me because of, unfortunately, my phenotype and who I am, and not really my phenotype, because of the peculiar way that race is understood in our society. I tend to, when shopping, stay away from the aisle and reach for the items I want. Whereas people who are more privileged and often assumed not to be engaged in some criminal practice or less stigmatized, they can hug the owl and be close up to the owl without the cause of any concern. An anthropologist would look at this from a kinesics standpoint and say, well, it's interesting in paying attention to how bodies move through space. Now, there's a whole world of something in understanding bodily movement through space, but we're going to move on and talk about some more obvious ways that you might understand. Nonverbal expressions convey same messages amongst all people. When people are happy, or when they're sad, or when they're puzzled, or when they're angered, we tend to show like a universal response. It's almost as if we're wired, irrespective of culture. But if I smile, that's a nonverbal form of communication that says I'm pleased or pleasured, or I find some enjoyment or excitement in something. If I make a facial expression of a frown, that is a nonverbal form of communication, which means I'm displeased. I find displeasure in something or someone. Proxemics is another way in which we understand communication. Proxemics is the study of space and distance. In the United States, we have a certain grammar on how we should space ourselves. Intimate partners are comfortable anywhere between 0 and 18 inches apart. Personal friends can be 2 feet apart. But if I don't know you, social distance must be 4 feet or more apart. Now, what happens when a stranger violates this understanding of our sense of space and distance? In other words, you meet someone and they are 0 to 18 inches from you and you don't know them that well. This is quite discomforting, disorienting. It creates anxiety. It also generates fear. And so that proxemic, or that space and distance between two people in this sense creates sends across all kinds of messages that only the person who is receiving it understands. For example, I traveled to Dominican Republic, and the people in the Dominican Republic, I stayed in Santo Domingo, and the people in Santo Domingo tend to communicate very closely. Women tend to hold hands, and they hug and kiss each other, and the men are rather close. And this shouldn't imply any kinds of sexual connotations. Their cultural understandings of proxemics are such that the men are not intimidated or threatened by another man's closeness, and neither are the women. This doesn't mean that there isn't same-sex experiences there. What I'm simply suggesting to you is that proxemics is culturally informed. There's a grammar for it, and in the U.S. we have certain understandings about space. Now, what I would like for you all to do is to walk up to a stranger and just test this out, and close distance with that stranger while asking for a very general question, like, where is the building at here on campus? But do it so that you're 0 to 18 inches away from them. The closer the better. Now, only do it in a way that you know, don't do it in a dark alley. I mean, because that might cause someone to react in defense of their life and liberty. Do it in an open situation where the person has room to sort of step back away from you. But it is the fact that they will step back that suggests to you that you are in their intimate space. And likewise, talk to a close friend from a social distance of 4 feet or more, and you will notice that that close friend will close in, at least into the personal space of yours, because speaking to a friend 4 feet apart may in fact be interpreted as being rude. Going beyond or outside of these general limits might result in a misunderstanding. So I want to just point out to you, for example, where, and I'll go ahead and put some questions for critical thought here, but I want to point out to you what happens in a society that is impacted by globalization, where people physically are moving across sovereign borders, moving throughout cities, and not just visiting, but staying there. What happens when you're in a very diverse society with, in fact, people from all around the world? The U.S. is one of the most diverse countries in the world. Everyone wants to be here in the U.S., if not to stay, but to visit. Anyway, I put these critical thought questions here because I want you to think about this, but I also want you to do the experiment that I offered you. Let's talk about sociolinguistics. And remember, I'm going to pivot back, because I'm going to pivot back to the 5 properties of language. But I just want to sort of give you some context and other ways in which we think about language. Sociolinguistics is concerned with what does language mean, and how is one's social status shaped during the enculturation process. What is the social situation in which people speak? How is power reflected in language and the enculturation process? Sociolinguistics is a specialty within culture anthropology that studies how language is related to culture and the social use of speech. In other words, do men and women communicate differently? And do men and women communicate to each other differently? Is there a hierarchy involved? Now, I want to digress shortly, and I want to ask you all that once Focus Group 1 posts their presentation, I would like for you to visit that presentation and comment on their questions. I also want you to read, it's a very short article on male and female miscommunication. But I want you to read it. I mean, unfortunately, we didn't get to have the focus group presentation as we needed it, and it's to no fault of Focus Group 1. It's just that Blackboard has some limitations, and in designing the course, I didn't see those limitations at first. But I want you to look back at language. Do blacks and whites speak differently? And we're not talking about dialect. Is there a different way of rules of engagement? And more importantly, when blacks and whites have social intercourse or exchange, do in fact we recognize a hierarchy in the way in which they speak. I used to have this one teacher in high school. I loved him really dearly. He's my history professor. Well, this guy always came in with a cup of coffee, and I didn't like the coffee smell on his breath, but he would always, pat me on the head when I did a good job. And he had no ill intent. He was a white school teacher, historian, history teacher. And one day I had a conversation with him. Of course, it was at the end of the year, and I said, "Well, why do you pat me on the head?" And we talked, and of course he said that he had no ill intentions. He just was proud of me. And I told him that in fact makes me feel inferior, and it makes me feel like a pet. And I'm not a pet, I'm a human being. And this brings me to a related point. If in fact you are from different cultural standpoints, sometimes you're unaware that your actions may in fact offend the receiver. This is why diversity is so important. Diversity is not important just so that we can have different people and different faces on campus. It's an opportunity for us to learn from other people, to become true cosmopolitan citizens, if that makes sense. And when we learn from other people, we begin to understand something about their semantic domains. A semantic domain simply represents a class of things or properties that are perceived as alike in some fundamental respect, and there's a hierarchy. They hierarchically are organized. So, for example, a chair, a table, an ottoman, a cabinet. These are the semantic domains of furniture. And I can call a chair, a table, an ottoman, etc., etc. And what I call it or what I label it is arbitrary and conventional according to that culture that I'm in. Because in Spanish, it might be a mesa for a table or a silla for a chair. And it doesn't mean that the silla or the mesa is somehow improper. But nevertheless, these represent part of the semantic domain. A semantic domain is a set of words that belongs to an inclusive class, basically. It's hierarchically structured. It depends on the importance of the objects or the actions in people's lives. Islands, coastal, river people is dependent on fish, or people who are dependent on fish are likely to have these categories and subcategories of aquatic life. You won't see part of the semantic domain, fish and riverfronts and coastal plains in the Sahara Desert or amongst its people who occupy the desert. Right? So it has to have meaning for people. Sapir-Whorf said, in fact, that we don't shape language. In some ways, language shapes us. It's this idea that language significantly shapes the perception and worldviews of its speakers. And remember, we said that the 5 important attributes of culture was what? Symbols, norms, values, worldviews, and ways of classifying. Sapir-Whorf, Edward Sapir, and Benjamin Whorf had this idea that language significantly shapes the perception and worldviews of its speakers, as opposed to us shaping language. Language, in fact, helps to define the worldview of its speakers by providing labels for certain kinds of phenomenon, semantic domains, or things, or concepts, qualities, actions, and which different languages define according to a different criteria. Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis is our perceptions and thoughts, our processes, shaped by our language, or by the language community into which we are born in. So you may have a different perception, a worldview, if you grow up in, for example, Saudi Arabia, and the language there shapes people's perception, for example, about their relationship with women in Al-Islam. And the language, and this is really important, because if Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is correct, and you believe it, you subscribe to it, then one of the ways in which we can think about changing culture and changing society is thinking about the language. In language, do we find examples of oppressive sort of schemes? Do we find, one time the term queer, for example, was very offensive. And then we evolved, or some people evolved and said that homosexual was an offensive term. And so we realized that in the language itself, that we had to change the way in which we define community. And so we reverted back to queers. Now, another way in which we change the language is we ask people what pronoun do they like to be referred by, and particularly members of the queer community. But this applies to us all. Do you want to be referred to in the masculine pronoun or feminine pronoun, or neither? And so part of changing the way in which we our worldview is thought about is changing the very words in which we speak. Now, on a college campus, only recently do we have this phenomenon of having gender-neutral bathrooms. But if we buy Sapir-Whorf's hypothesis, part of having these gender-neutral bathrooms, by the way, because prior to or hitherto, we forced gender on people. We said either you're male or male or female. We sort of impose sex on people, when in fact both science and our cultural understanding suggest that gender is fluid and sexual identity is fluid. But perhaps we enabled the phenomenon of gender-neutral bathrooms by changing the language on how we address members of the queer community. So our perceptions and thought processes are shaped by language, the language community in which we have been born. The world is not directly perceptible through our ordinary sense, because categories of language bias our interpretations of sensory inputs. And so Sapir-Whorf said, look, there's some things that you won't detect or you won't perceive. If your language causes you not to detect, or if it limits you, if it biases you, if it blinds you, if it puts on blinders. When the colonists first came to the U.S., or what has become the U.S., the 13 colonies, their reference to the indigenous populations here was that they were savages. Well, if your language says that they are savages and all the other attendant terms that go along with savages, then the colonists could never see the humanity of the indigenous people. In fact, the result of the lack of perceptibility of the humanity of these indigenous peoples was that many of the forefathers, and I'm talking about before our forefathers, I'm talking about the pilgrims and the early colonists, they killed off the indigenous people. And they didn't see any problems with doing so. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is also known as linguistic relativity hypothesis. And thinking about cultural relative hypothesis, when conducting anthropological work, we want to judge people according to their own linguistic standards. We don't want to come and impose our ideas on them. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis says if language shapes thought, we should see a change in the perception and worldviews at a rate comparable to the rate of language change. But in fact, language is slow with regards to worldviews. Worldviews tend to change much faster. So there is some critique and some criticism against the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, I want to break away from this and I want to talk about, I want to discuss with you these principles of language. First, I want to talk about discreteness. And again, discreteness means that when people combine units of sound and words, they do so according to conventional rules. And that knowing a language means, in fact, both knowing the units of sound and the rules for combining them, but also knowing the rules for combining actual words and meanings. In other words, that words are composed of discrete units of sound, phonemes, that are combined to communicate meaning. And we apply the same, we have to have the same conventional understandings and rules, or like I call grammar, of combining words. Discreteness or discrete sounds are essential units of communication. They are the building blocks of language. Discreteness makes alphabets, in fact, possible. Sounds by themselves, in most cases, they don't carry meanings. So if you take the absolute sounds of cat, k, eh, t, by themselves, they mean nothing. It's only when we assemble them according to the conventional rules of assembling sounds that we can produce some meaning. Words then are composed of sound combinations that a particular speech community, a cultural speech community, recognizes, and that if in fact you're not from that community, you will not recognize. Just as all language use small numbers of sounds to make large numbers of words, so words are combined according to grammatical rules, again, to convey messages that can be complex, or sentences that are complex, or simple, but mostly complex. And so therefore, by mastering a language's words and meanings and conventional rules, for combining those words and understanding those meanings, and for those phonemes or phonetic sounds that become words, we in fact become empowered to begin to understand other culture. I want to talk about arbitrariness. I hinted towards it earlier, but the relationship between sounds or words has no bearing on the labels that we in fact give those sounds and words. In English we say horse, in Spanish we say caballo. And neither one are improper ways of calling this animal, and there's nothing inherent about this living creature that makes it a horse or a caballo. So in other words, there has to be some arbitrariness to it. In other words, that we have to be able to apply our terms to it, and it has to stand, and it becomes conventional, that we all say that this is the word that we want to use for this object or this organism. There's the third property of language is that it's productive, and productivity refers to a speaker's ability to create a totally novel sentence. In fact, to create an infinite number of expressions out of a finite number of words. Every language has a finite number of words. In fact, it has a finite number of phonetic sounds. Now, neologism is the creation of new words. Yeah, we create new words, but by and large, most languages, speech communities, have a limited sort of linguistic repertoire, or a linguistic lexicon. But we can combine through understanding the conventional rules. We can combine a very finite set of phonemes or phonetic sounds into words, and a very limited group of morphemes or words into infinite expressions. So in fact, it's productive. Fourthly, the fourth property of language is its sort of displacement. And displacement refers to our ability to talk about objects and people and things and events that are remote, right, in time and in space. Things that happened yesterday that are happening now, or that will happen tomorrow. Very abstract things, you know, like we can talk about ghosts. Happy belated Halloween to all of you. But we can talk about ghosts, for example. In fact, Halloween might be going on for some of you well into the present. Some of you waiting for the weekend to enjoy Halloween, and that's fine with me. But just keep in mind that one's culture is not one's costume. In other words, to appropriate the culture of another group and wear it as a costume is in fact very offensive. Just something to think about. Displacement property makes it possible to describe things like a ghost or zombie, as I said, to talk about avatar or so on and so forth. It's about our ability to talk about the abstract, that which isn't concrete, that which is sort of displaced over time. And we can do that. And then finally, which is the most beautiful part of language, and I'm going to end on this point, language has a multimedia capacity. In other words, we in fact can speak it, as I'm doing now. We can write it, as you see on this PowerPoint presentation. We can gesture it, as I'm intentionally being very sort of filled with gestures, right? Hopefully this gesture means that I'm excited about anthropology. We can communicate it through the way in which we move our bodies. We can communicate it through chemicals. For example, perfumes, colognes. There are organisms in our world that actually communicate through pheromones. So you can communicate through smell. You can also communicate through touch. So if you think about Braille, right, for people who have a particular accessibility issue, they can read Braille, so it's tactile, and they can sign, which is an important type of gesture. Language distinguishes us quite tremendously from other organisms. It gives the Homo sapien its uniqueness. I hope that you all enjoyed reading this chapter. And again, I want to apologize for the technical difficulties that we are having in this course. I think this is week 2. I think we'll have those issues resolved going forward. But things happen, and we'll continue to do what people of culture do, and that is adapt. Thank you for your attention, and have a great day.